It has been nearly 50 years since a crime shook England to its core. In the early 1970s, a quiet man named Michael Taylor committed one of the most gruesome murders in the nation's history. When the police finally subdued him and demanded to know why he had done such an unthinkable thing, his answer sent a chill through every heart that heard it. "The devil made me do it." To this day, those words linger like a curse. The idea that an unseen, malevolent force could seize control of a human being and drive them to madness is one of humanity's oldest and darkest fears. For as long as people have looked into the night and felt something looking back, they've believed in possession, the terrifying notion that evil could invade the soul. Ancient civilizations across the world told tales of spirits that could overtake the mind. The Sumerians spoke of demons that crept into sleeping bodies, whispering vile commands. Hebraic texts told of Lilith, Adam's first wife, who turned away from God and consorted with dark spirits. They said she came to men in their dreams, feeding on their weakness. The Old Testament described King Saul's torment by evil spirits until the young David's psalms drove them away. In the New Testament, Jesus cast out legions of demons from the possessed, restoring them to peace. From the jinn of Islamic belief to the Rakshasas of Hindu mythology, the world's oldest faiths share one thread: the belief that unseen entities can manipulate the minds of the living, bending them to do unspeakable things. Over the centuries, exorcisms became the last line of defense, sacred rituals meant to drive out evil and reclaim the soul. Yet, as science and psychology advanced, society began to question whether these were truly supernatural events or merely the tragic symptoms of mental illness misunderstood by the faithful. Still, there are cases that defy explanation. In 1949, a boy in Baltimore named Robbie Mannheim underwent a harrowing exorcism said to have inspired The Exorcist, one of the most influential horror films of all time. And in 1976, the death of Anneliese Michel, a young German woman who died during an exorcism, raised haunting questions about faith, medicine, and the limits of human endurance, later immortalized in The Exorcism of Emily Rose. But amid these infamous cases, there is one that remains largely forgotten outside England: the case of Michael Taylor, a mild-mannered husband and father from a quiet Yorkshire village who, one calm October morning in 1974, claimed to have been overtaken by the devil himself. What followed would become one of the most horrifying and mysterious crimes in British history. It was early on Sunday, October 6, 1974, in the small, misty village of Ossett, West Yorkshire. The air was crisp, the streets still, and most of the townsfolk were preparing for morning mass, a ritual of comfort and faith that had bound the community together for generations. But just beyond the sound of church bells, one woman picked up her phone in trembling panic. Outside her window, she saw a man sprinting past her gate, smeared in what she first thought was red paint. He was shouting incoherently, crying out about Satan. When she called the police, she could never have known that this frantic, blood-soaked man had just committed one of the most unimaginable acts ever recorded in English crime, or that his name would soon be whispered with dread for decades to come. Before the tragedy that would forever change his name, Michael Taylor was known as a kind and gentle soul. Friends and neighbors described him as cheerful, polite, and devoted to his wife Christine and their 5 children. He lived his entire life in the quiet town of Ossett, where everyone knew each other's names and secrets were few. He worked humble jobs, never earning much, yet he carried himself with warmth and humor. Neighbors often recalled the sound of laughter echoing from the Taylors' home, and Michael was known for telling jokes that made even the most serious villagers smile. But that laughter would not last. In the spring of 1974, Michael suffered a fall while repairing a roof. The injury seemed minor at first, but the pain never left him. His back ached constantly, his sleep grew restless, and his once sunny disposition began to darken. Forced to quit his job, he struggled to find steady work, and soon depression began to take hold. By June, he had found a position as a butcher, low-paying, grueling, but enough to support his family. Yet those close to him noticed a strange change. He grew irritable, prone to sudden mood swings, and uncharacteristically distant. The man who once spent his evenings playing with his children now sat alone, staring into nothing. His wife Christine worried deeply. She confided to friends that something in her husband had shifted, something she could not explain. He had grown cold and unpredictable. His smiles were rare, his temper sharp, and his eyes sometimes seemed to carry a faraway look, as if he were fighting something only he could see. Out of concern, a family friend named Barbara Wardman suggested that Michael seek comfort in faith. Ossett was a deeply religious town, the kind where church attendance was more than a habit, it was a rhythm of life. Barbara belonged to a local prayer circle known as the Christian Fellowship Group, a small but fervent congregation led by a young woman named Marie Robinson. She believed that the group could help restore Michael's peace of mind. So on September 12, 1974, Michael attended his first meeting. The gathering took place in a modest hall filled with song, prayer, and worshipers speaking in tongues. There, under the soft glow of candlelight, he met Marie, a 21-year-old faith leader, with striking conviction and a presence that seemed to command the room. Marie claimed to have the gift of divine communication, the ability to sense and cast out evil spirits. She spoke of a holy war between God and the devil, and her followers believed she was chosen to stand on the front line. When she met Michael, she welcomed him warmly, assuring him that God had a purpose for his suffering. From that night forward, Michael was changed. He became consumed by Marie's teachings, attending every meeting, sometimes even when none were scheduled. The two spent long hours together in prayer, often in private. Marie would pray with him deep into the night, urging him to open himself fully to God's will. Soon their bond became the subject of whispers. Villagers noticed Michael leaving his home late at night to meet with Marie, and rumors spread that their prayers were more intimate than holy. Christine, hurt and suspicious, tried to ignore the gossip, until she could not. By October, Michael's behavior had grown increasingly unstable. At home, he was volatile, snapping at his wife and children for the smallest things. Yet whenever he was with Marie, he appeared euphoric, as if she were the only one who could calm him. His obsession deepened until even his friends began to fear something was terribly wrong. Then, on the evening of October 1st, 1974, Christine decided to confront her husband, not in private, but in front of the entire fellowship group. What happened that night would shatter the last fragile pieces of Michael's sanity. The meeting began like any other that night inside the small fellowship hall. The faithful gathered in a tight circle, their voices rising in hymns and prayer. But there was tension in the air, a quiet unease that rippled through the congregation the moment Christine Taylor entered. For weeks she had endured the gossip, the long absences, and her husband's sudden temper. That night she had resolved to face it all head-on. As the prayers ended and the group began to share testimonies, Christine stood and turned to Michael, her voice trembling but firm. She accused him of betraying her trust, of having an affair with Marie Robinson. The room fell silent. Marie, standing at the front, turned pale. All eyes shifted toward Michael. For a moment he said nothing. Then something inside him seemed to snap. Without warning, Michael let out a guttural scream and lunged across the room. He struck out at Marie with such fury that several men had to grab him and pull him to the ground. His face twisted into something unrecognizable, his eyes wild, and his mouth foaming as he cursed in a torrent of words that no one could understand. Witnesses would later describe the sound as inhuman, a mixture of growling and shrieking. Some claimed he spoke in tongues, others swore they saw his body contort as though some invisible force was twisting him from within. The congregation broke into cries of prayer, calling out to Jesus as Marie began to shout above the chaos. She screamed the name of Christ again and again, begging whatever had taken hold of Michael to release him. The struggle lasted nearly an hour before he finally went limp, collapsing to the floor in exhaustion. When he awoke the next morning, Michael claimed to remember nothing. He apologized to Marie, confused and ashamed, and she, shaken but devout, forgave him. Yet deep down, she feared what she had seen in his eyes. Several members of the group began to whisper that Michael was possessed. Others thought he was simply unstable, but none could deny that something unnatural had taken place that night. Even Marie, once so certain of her faith, could not shake the feeling that she had witnessed something far darker than human rage. In the days that followed, Michael's mood swung wildly. He would weep uncontrollably, then laugh without reason. His wife confided to neighbors that she feared for her safety. At times, he claimed to hear voices. At others, he would sit in silence for hours, staring at the walls as if listening to something no one else could hear. Soon, word of his behavior reached the local vicar, who decided to intervene. After several visits, he became convinced that Michael's condition was beyond medical help. He requested assistance from the Anglican Church of England, warning that the man might be under demonic influence. The church agreed to send help. 2 ministers were assigned to investigate: Father Peter Vincent, an Anglican priest, and Reverend Raymond Smith, a Methodist minister experienced in spiritual counseling. When they met Michael, they too were unsettled. His demeanor shifted from calm to violent in seconds, and when they mentioned prayer, his body began to tremble. After observing him for some time, both men reached the same conclusion: an exorcism was necessary. They arranged for the ritual to take place on the night of October 5, 1974, at St. Thomas's Church in the nearby town of Barnsley. As the ministers prepared for the ceremony, no one could have foreseen the horror that would follow in the hours to come. It was late on the night of October 5, 1974, when the small group gathered inside St. Thomas's Church. The doors were locked, the windows covered, and only candlelight flickered along the ancient stone walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but within the church the air was thick, heavy with incense, fear, and the tension of what was about to unfold. At the center of the floor knelt Michael Taylor, trembling and pale. Around him stood Father Peter Vincent, Reverend Raymond Smith, and a handful of assistants prepared to witness the ceremony. For hours leading up to this moment, Michael had been quiet, but as the priests began their prayers, something inside him changed. The instant Father Vincent called upon the name of Christ, Michael let out a deep growl, a sound that seemed to rise from somewhere far below his chest, as if it belonged to something else entirely. His eyes rolled back, his body convulsed, and the calm man who had once been a loving husband was gone. The exorcism had begun. As the priests continued their prayers, Michael began to shout in a voice that was not his own. He cursed, spat, and screamed words in languages no one recognized. His strength was unnatural, so much that they were forced to tie him down to prevent him from harming himself or others. Witnesses said the air grew colder, and the candles flickered violently, as if the room itself resisted what was happening. For 8 long hours, the priests battled against what they described as 40 demons. Among them, they claimed, were spirits of lust, blasphemy, lewdness, anger, pride, and even masochism. Father Vincent later said he could feel the evil radiating from Michael, a presence that mocked them as they prayed. At times, Michael's voice would shift entirely, as though other personalities were taking turns speaking through him. Some were defiant, others weeping or taunting. The 2 clergymen pressed on, shouting holy words into the darkness, sprinkling holy water across his writhing body and demanding the demons reveal their names. By the early hours of the morning, they were drenched in sweat and exhaustion. When Michael finally collapsed in silence, they believed they had succeeded, at least partly. They declared that most of the demons had been cast out, but there were 3 that refused to leave. According to both priests, these remaining entities were murder, insanity, and violence. Father Vincent and Reverend Smith warned Michael that these spirits still lingered inside him and urged caution. But after such a brutal night, they were physically and emotionally drained. Michael seemed calm, lucid even, and begged to go home to rest. Against their better judgment, they agreed. They released him early that morning, unaware that within hours their decision would lead to one of the most horrifying scenes England had ever witnessed. As Michael and Christine returned home to Ossett, the first rays of sunlight fell over the quiet village. The neighbors went about their routines, unaware that by midday, the Taylors' home would become a house of terror. It was just after noon on October 6, 1974, when police in Ossett received a frantic call reporting a disturbance near the Taylor residence. The caller described a man running through the streets, naked and covered in what looked like red paint, shouting about Satan. Officer Ian Walker was the first to respond. When he arrived, he found the man crouched in the middle of the road, trembling and giggling uncontrollably. As Walker approached, the smell hit him first. Metallic, sharp, unmistakable. What he'd assumed was paint was something far worse. The man was Michael Taylor, and he was covered head to toe in blood. Walker knelt beside him, cautiously asking if he was hurt. Michael looked up with empty eyes, his voice barely audible. "It's the blood of Satan," he whispered. Then, after a pause that chilled the officer to his core, he said, "I think I've hurt someone." Backup arrived within minutes, and as the officers followed the trail of blood to the Taylors' small brick home, they steeled themselves for the worst. Nothing, however, could have prepared them for what they would find inside. The front door was ajar. The house was silent. But in the living room lay Christine Taylor, her body mutilated beyond recognition. She had been strangled and torn apart with an intensity that defied comprehension. Her face had been destroyed, her eyes gouged out, her tongue ripped from her mouth, and the flesh of her cheeks and neck torn away as though by claws. The family's small poodle was found nearby, killed and mutilated in the same horrific fashion. Blood covered the walls and floor. The scene was so violent that officers later described it as something out of a nightmare. When the coroner examined Christine's body, he discovered that she had choked on her own blood before she died. The brutality was not quick. It was prolonged, deliberate, and almost ritualistic. Investigators quickly determined that Michael had been responsible. After the killing, it appeared he had stripped off his clothes, bathed himself in the blood, and run out into the street in a state of madness. Witnesses recalled him shouting that he had destroyed the evil in her and screaming about the devil's blood. When confronted with the evidence, Michael seemed confused. He admitted that the blood must have been his wife's, but insisted he remembered nothing of the murder itself. He was calm, almost childlike, as police led him away. News of the killing spread through Ossett like wildfire. The townsfolk, a community rooted in faith and routine, were struck speechless. Many could not bring themselves to believe that the same man who once smiled at them on Sunday mornings had committed such an atrocity. But when word reached the press that Michael had undergone an exorcism less than 24 hours before the murder, the story took on a life of its own. Reporters swarmed the small village, headlines screamed of "the devil's work," and the question that haunted everyone was simple. Had the church released something it could not control? Even the coroner, in his official report, listed the estimated time of Christine's death at around 10 a.m., just 2 hours after Michael left St. Thomas's Church. The press descended on Ossett in force. They wanted answers, and so did the nation. Who was to blame for this unimaginable act? Was it the man himself, the church that tried to cleanse him, or something far older and darker that had slipped through the cracks of faith and reason? In the days that followed, the quiet village of Ossett transformed into a scene of chaos. Reporters from across England descended upon it, eager to uncover the story behind the so-called devil's murder. Locals who had once spoken freely about their neighbor now avoided questions, their faces pale with disbelief. No one could reconcile the kind, soft-spoken Michael Taylor they had known with the blood-soaked figure police had carried away that morning. But the deeper investigators dug, the stranger the story became. Word spread that Michael had undergone an official exorcism just hours before the killing, sanctioned by the church itself. The revelation sent shockwaves through both the public and the clergy. Suddenly, this was no longer just a murder case. It was a question of faith, madness, and the price of human belief. Michael was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric institution reserved for Britain's most dangerous and unstable offenders. Doctors described him as calm, but detached, as though in the aftermath of some immense storm. He showed no signs of guilt or anger, only confusion. When asked about his wife, he would simply shake his head and whisper that he remembered nothing. Meanwhile, blame began to spread like wildfire. The Christian Fellowship group came under immediate scrutiny. Critics accused them of being little more than a fanatical cult, manipulating vulnerable minds under the guise of religion. Some claimed their meetings encouraged hysteria and emotional frenzy rather than spiritual healing. At the center of it all was Marie Robinson, the young faith leader whose relationship with Michael had sparked the tragedy. Rumors of an affair resurfaced, painting her as the temptress who had led a fragile man into spiritual ruin. Others pitied her, believing she too had been swept into something beyond her control. Then attention turned to the two priests, Father Peter Vincent and Reverend Raymond Smith, who had performed the exorcism. Newspapers portrayed them as reckless and naive, suggesting that their failed ritual had unleashed something uncontrollable within Michael's mind. One particularly damning report quoted witnesses saying that during the exorcism, the priests had claimed to drive out nearly 40 demons, but had left 3: murder, madness, and violence. When it became public that they had allowed Michael to leave the church less than 2 hours before the killing, the outrage was immediate. Many demanded to know why the priest had not sought medical or police supervision for a man in such a state. The story turned from tragedy to scandal almost overnight. By the time Michael's trial began on February 17, 1975, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every seat, and the public waited outside, hungry for details. Prosecuting barrister Jeffrey Baker opened with a statement that stunned even the seasoned reporters present. He described the case as so bizarre that one might believe they had stepped back into the Middle Ages. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven to the brink by religious hysteria, someone manipulated by well-meaning but dangerously misguided zealots. They argued that the hours of chanting, restraint, and spiritual coercion had pushed Michael into a psychotic break, culminating in the brutal murder of his wife. The defense, however, turned the argument around. They claimed that Michael Taylor was not an evil man but a victim, a pawn in the hands of a small cult that convinced him he was possessed. They argued that the group's obsession with demons and sin had broken him psychologically, blurring the line between his faith and his sanity. The defense placed the blame squarely on the church, the fellowship, and the ritual that had ripped his mind apart. As the trial went on, the courtroom became a battleground between science and religion. Psychiatrists testified that Michael suffered from acute schizophrenia and psychotic depression, conditions that could easily have been worsened by the emotional intensity of the exorcism. But religious witnesses stood firm, insisting that evil itself had been at work. When the time came for the jury to deliberate, the nation waited. The verdict would determine not only Michael's fate, but the credibility of the church's most ancient rite. After days of testimony, the jury returned their decision in March 1975. Their verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Michael Taylor would not face prison for the murder of his wife. Instead, he was ordered to spend 2 years under psychiatric observation at Broadmoor Hospital, followed by continued treatment at other secure mental institutions. The court accepted that at the time of the killing, Michael was in a state of severe mental breakdown, a man overtaken by delusion, not malice. For the church, the outcome was devastating. The trial's publicity had drawn fierce criticism from the public and the media alike. Headlines condemned the Anglican Church's involvement in ancient superstition, calling the exorcism a reckless act that had ended in tragedy. Under growing pressure, the Church of England released an official statement declaring that no further exorcisms would ever be performed by its clergy without explicit authorization from higher authorities, a policy that still stands to this day. As for Michael, his life after Broadmoor was a slow descent into obscurity. After years of treatment, he was released in 1979, returning to a world that viewed him with a mixture of pity and fear. The once cheerful husband and father was now a broken man, isolated and haunted by a past he could neither remember nor escape. He was never reunited with his children. The community that once embraced him kept its distance, and while he occasionally appeared in public, those who saw him described a man hollowed by regret, his face pale, his eyes distant, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. By 1981, He had been hospitalized multiple times following several suicide attempts, each one deeper and more desperate than the last. Doctors described him as suffering from recurring episodes of depression, paranoia, and intrusive religious delusions. Then, decades later, in 2005, Michael Taylor's name returned to the headlines once more. He had been arrested again, this time for making inappropriate advances toward a young girl. The incident was minor compared to his past, but it reignited public fear. Newspapers dredged up the old story, reminding everyone of the possessed butcher of Osset. He was again committed to psychiatric care, and after his release, faded once more into the shadows. What became of him after that remains uncertain. Some reports suggest he lived quietly under supervision, while others claim he moved away from Osset altogether. But the question that lingered, the one that no trial, priest, or doctor could ever answer, was whether Michael Taylor had truly been mentally ill, or whether something far darker had taken hold of him that night in 1974. Was he a man driven to madness by religious obsession, or a vessel for something inhuman that the exorcism only disturbed further? We know the facts. We know the sequence of events. Yet the truth, the why, remains elusive. If his psychosis was born purely of the mind, then perhaps Michael Taylor was simply a tragic victim of belief and circumstance. But if the priests were right, if the exorcism failed to expel all the evil that dwelled inside him, then what became of those last remaining demons? Murder, insanity, and violence. Did they truly leave him? Or did they remain, dormant but alive, buried somewhere in the shadows of his broken mind? Nearly half a century later, the story of Michael Taylor stands as a grim warning, a reminder that faith and fear are often separated by a very thin line, and that when the human mind begins to fracture, it can become the perfect vessel for something unspeakable. Perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: if evil can hide within an ordinary man from an ordinary town, smiling among his neighbors, praying among his friends, then how many of us could claim we would recognize it, if it ever chose us?